There was a headline in a New York City newspaper that startled me some time ago. I don't remember exactly when now. But it said, the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy is going to fall. I think I heard something like that not too long ago again. But this was back in 2007. Well, let's see, it's 2019 now. And to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't fallen. One of those things that my grandmother taught me was one of the 7 wonders of the world was the Tower of Pisa, and one of those 7 wonders was going to fall. If the article was correct, some scientists predict the fall to be some 11, 12 years ago now. Well, now over 800 years old, this 179-foot tower reportedly began to lean even when it was being originally completed due to the neglect of its foundation. Europe's Westchester Cathedral, dedicated in the year 1093 AD, is one, if not the oldest Gothic churches in Europe. It's also another case in point where the original foundation of tree trunks laid flat on soft and sometimes moist soil would one day fail to support the enormous weight of this giant structure. In 1905, ominous cracks spurred extensive investigation of the foundation. Finally, a costly 5.5 years shoring it up again, the rotting foundation was replaced with one made of concrete. It's far easier in the long run, less expensive, and a lot wiser to build a rock-solid foundation from the start when you're wanting to support something of that value and of that importance. What could be of more value, what could be of more importance than our lives themselves? And the lives of our children and youth in our world. Not just our own children, but just youth and children in our whole society. What could be of more value and importance than these lives? Something that can be trusted, never to fail, supporting their lives. A father came home one day with packages for his wife. His young daughter, Betsy, temporarily confined to a wheelchair because of a bad fall she had recently taken, reached out for a hug from her dad. He asked, "Where's Mom?" The reply came, "Upstairs." "What have you got in the packages, Dad?" "Oh, just some things she asked me to get at the store." "Let me carry them to Mom," Betsy said. Dad, with a smile, replied, "Why, Betsy dear, how can you carry these packages upstairs when you can't carry yourself yet?" Betsy's reply, also with a smile, ready at hand, was, "No, Dad, I can't. But if you'll give me the packages, then I'll carry them and you can carry me." Somewhere in that simple story, I hear God's voice, speaking softly but clearly to our hearts about a bedrock foundation that underlies life, our church, and in the end, all of society. It is our faith and confidence in God's arms beneath us and around us, our trust in life being carried by God, that we have the inspiration and then the courage to carry many of the responsibilities that God places in our hands, to carry them to the world. We could never do it by ourselves. As Christians, we carry what we do because our faith is founded on the bedrock foundation of knowing that Christ is risen and carries us. We are a people of Easter faith. Faith that Christ is risen and is carrying us as we carry forward His mission is the essential foundation upon which the purpose and mission of any faithful church is built. What did Jesus say to disciple Peter when Peter confessed that he believed Jesus to be the long-awaited Messiah and the Son of the living God? Well, Jesus said to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church." On just this foundation, faith in Christ. The Apostle Paul said to the first century Christians, "If Christ has not been raised, then our proclamation has been in vain, and our faith has been in vain." For almost 2,000 years since Paul said those words to the early Christians, faith in Christ risen has been the one foundation that has prevailed over against all of the destructive winds, rain, and floods of time, proven over and over again to be true. In the gospel today, there are accounts of those who first witnessed Christ risen from the dead. We cannot be witnesses back then, but we are witnesses to our faith today. Back then, as it is recorded, Mary Magdalene ran to the tomb, and then she ran to the disciples to tell them, "I have seen the Lord." How do we claim to see the Lord today? How does one come to recognize the Spirit of Christ alive in the world? Well, how do you recognize anyone you are close to? You recognize people by their personalities, their spirits, their values, the fruits of their lives after they have become familiar to you. Sometimes you can recognize someone with your blindfold on by these other things. To recognize Christ in the midst of life, you must know what he is like. Some of his familiar ways. You must study his life, his teachings, his values, his spirit of including all people in his circle of forgiveness and grace and love and concern, enemies and friends alike. His way of loving unconditionally. After all, on the cross he said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." Even his enemies received that unconditional concern from his heart. His requirements for justice, we need to learn what they are. His concern for people of low estate or on the fringes of our society. His concern for people trapped by their own sins or injured by the sins of others. His concern for and willingness to make sacrifices for those who are poor, those who are ill, and for those denied justice or deprived of their God-given human rights in this world. One must also know of Christ's at oneness with the will of God. Remember, he spent time in the wilderness making that decision that nothing else would usurp his following and being faithful to the will of God when he was tempted. One must also know his oneness with the will of God because he does not compromise this. When you see people loving their neighbors, forgiving their enemies, seeking fairness for the poor, stopping to help injured people, going beyond, walking a second mile, third mile, etc., with someone who has asked for a little help and a little time. When you see people visiting the lonely or sharing each other's burdens, caring for the ill, acting as thankful stewards for what they have, doing justice in society, loving mercy more than retaliation and vengeance, and urging warring factions to sit down at the table and negotiate, and on and on. When you see such things happening, take a second look. And then take a third look. These are not things that happen ordinarily in the world. These are not what the world considers as normal, everyday behaviors. Things like those listed above happen when you allow Christ to be the very foundation that holds you up and carries your life, your thoughts and your devotions, and your responsibilities to serve in his name. It's not always easy, but when the going gets tough, the tough keep going, as we have heard. They didn't typically happen consistently. These things I just mentioned, they don't happen consistently when the world is left to go on its own. It is Christ doing new things. It's His Spirit in our midst, doing the unusual and the unexpected and the way above average things in the midst of the world in which we live. As people of His discipleship, we should recognize those things when we see them. And then we join in with them. It is Christ risen, these things rooted in the hearts of people for whom Christ is the sure foundations, are signs of a spiritual power that is loose in our world, a power of love that cannot ultimately be defeated. It's a spiritual foundation upon which to build a life, a marriage, a family, a church, a nation, a world, with which will one day finally be at peace with God and everyone with one another. And so we are Easter Christians. Everything about the life of Jesus requires of us a daily decision. His teachings, will we follow them? Do we know them? Do we study them? His authority to teach God's truth, do we accept it? Do we listen? Do we study His life? His style of being a servant to all. Will we live that way? Will we try to imitate Him? Will we say when we make decisions, what would Jesus do? And then do it. Not just ask the question and go on our way. We live in a Christ-filled world, Martin Luther once declared. And you and I are invited to bear witness to that and to follow Him each day. Everybody, the Lord is risen. Christ is risen indeed. The Lord is risen. Christ is risen indeed. If you wish to, you can stand and say it again if you're able. Christ is risen. How about us rising?
He is risen indeed.
Christ is risen indeed. Okay.